In the last segment of our ad design project, I'm going to talk about adding things like shape and color and type to our final design with an eye towards using composition to make our choices. So when we left off, we have our background for our ad, and we have a spot on the bottom with which to put our logo, and of course our sketch off to the side so we know what we're trying to accomplish. The first thing I'd like to do is I would like to talk about, composition again. I think in the earliest video I mentioned that I chose this photo partly because it has this wonderful directional arrow pointing up. It kind of bisects the piece in the middle, but it draws your eye up to this negative space right here at the top. When we do layouts, we want to create a focal point, a place for the eye to enter the piece and to start. And this is a great place to do a nice bold headline that speaks to the topic of the ad. And then we have a straight line then to draw our eye down to the bottom tag material, such as logos and URLs. So let's talk about how we actually get type in here. Well, Photoshop has a text tool just like every other Adobe Creative Suite product. It's the little letter T over here in the sidebar. Well, again, I'm just going to bring it up into my document window and I'm going to click and drag a text box. When I let up my mouse, you'll see that I have an insertion point here at the top, and it is actually centered already because that was the last orientation of text that was used. But if you look up in your control palette at the very top, now that I have a type tool selected, we have type tools such as left align, right align, and center. I want to leave this one on center. You'll also notice over here on the right side in the layers palette, when you add new text, it always comes in as a new layer. So once you've typed something in, you should be able to make sure that layer is selected and move it around with the move tool so you can reposition it as needed. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to type in my chosen tagline. And just typing that in, it's a little blah. It's a little small. It needs to be much bigger and bolder if it's going to serve as a focal point. So I am going to highlight that text with the type tool, and you can either find your palette called character, which mine is over here. If you do not see it, you can always go up to the window menu and look for character palette and it will pop up for you. And you also have font choices up in your control palette. I am going to go over to my character palette on the right side, and I am going to choose a font that I actually was considering earlier to save us some time. And I am going to increase the font size. So you have a font, you have your font name, the actual variation, remember the font family, and then you have the point size, which you can edit by typing right into the field. You can edit by clicking the pull down menu and from presets, or one thing that Photoshop has is really cool is called a scrubby slider. If you watch over here in this character palette, if I take my cursor and just run it over the little type symbol next to the field, it scrubs the number up as I drag my mouse across it. So that's bigger. That's a little bit better, but unfortunately what it also did, I'm going to click on the move tool in my toolbox so I can deselect that. Some problems here. It's a little too lacking in the leading, so I am going to go ahead and I'm going to take my type tool again, and I'm going to reselect the type, and over in the control or the little palette over here on the side, in addition to font size, you can also scrubby slider up your leading. Now, one thing that's nice about this particular typeface is that it is just a little bit grungy. So it kind of picks up on the texture of the flag at the bottom. So that is, when we're talking about composition, that is something that speaks to unity, making pieces feel like they belong together because they have similar attributes. I can't say as I am particularly crazy about that font though. I think it's maybe not as friendly as I would like it to be. That was one of the things we were tasked with, was to make it friendly for students. So I'm going to change it to something different. Again, I've pre-picked these, so it makes this a little bit easier. And I like this one a little bit better. I am going to click on my move tool and click away so I think that one's just a little bit easier to read. And now if I position it, you see as I have the layer selected so I can move it around with my move tool. You'll see that it actually snaps to an imaginary middle line. So now I know that that is centered with the rest of the document. I'm actually going to change my font color. And to do that, I am going to take that type tool again. I am going to select it all. And you have color palettes and you have swatches palettes. I actually tend to gravitate towards the swatches palette. And it will have a bunch of defaults or a bunch of colors that were the last thing that you used. If there's any of those colors in that set that you like, I'm just going to turn this to white. You can just click on that with the font selected and it will change to that color. Again, clicking the move tool to deselect everything. So that's actually a little bit easier to read. It pops out from the background a little bit more. I do want to introduce we have some brand colors to work with, and they are reds and blues, which may or may not be the exact reds and blues in the flag. So I want to actually add the exact brand colors to my swatches palette. In order to do that, I need to know what those colors are. So I'm going to refer back to the creative brief. And there is a dark blue in here with this hexadecimal code, or you can use the RGB build, or you can use a CMYK build, doesn't really matter. Or we can choose the red, or we can do both. I'm actually going to start with adding the red. So you kind of have to either write down or remember that number. And the best way I find to add colors is to go over, not in the swatches. You can actually go to the swatches. There's a pull-up menu to make new swatches, new groups. I actually like to go over into the toolbox on the left side, and there's a little set of swatches on the bottom that represent foreground color and background color. I like to double click on the foreground color and it gives me a color picker. And in that color picker, I get a space for a CMYK build, I get one for RGB, and I also get one for the hexadecimal code. Just going to refresh my memory as to what that number was. 820104. And that's the red that was specified in the creative brief. Once I plug that number in, I see it, I'm going to tell it, add to swatches. You can name it if you like. I'm not going to. And now if you look up, I'm going to go ahead and close this dialog box. You can see the red is up here in the swatches palette. So now if I want to do a little highlighting of something here, physics is hard, voting is not, I'm going to choose to make the word voting stand out. And when you're reading about composition, you know that one way to create contrast is to make something different. If all the text is white and I make the voting a different color, well then voting is going to stand out, and then voting is kind of the thrust of our ad here. So I am going to go ahead and highlight the word voting, and I am going to click on the red, click on my move tool to deselect. So now voting is nicely highlighted. I'm actually going to make sure that layer is selected, and I'm going to take my move tool and I'm going to move this down just a little bit so the voting is on top of the more white background, so it's a little bit easier to read. You will also notice that I have not made this so big that it fills up the entire space. I want to make sure that there is ample white space around the outer edge here, so it really serves to highlight the heading. All white space is not white. All negative space is not empty. Sometimes it's background texture, so this serves to really highlight the heading. I might also choose to add a second heading in here, so I'm going to click the type tool again, come down, and I am going to draw another text box. It's going to remember the last settings that I had, so I'm going to go ahead and type my secondary heading here. And you can see that I've got overflow text again, which means I've got way too much text for my space. So I'm going to put my cursor in there and I'm going to select all so I get everything that's hidden as well. And that is Command A or Control A. And with all of that selected, I am going to change my font, which I'm going to do here in the character palette. to something that also has a sort of a taller narrow, like my bigger, bolder font. I'm going to bring my size down. And it's all in one line, so I don't really need to adjust the leading. Add my period in there. Now, I do not care for that red. The red then kind of competes a little bit. I'm going to scoot it up a little bit. Kind of competes a little bit with my red in the voting, so I'm going to change that color. I am going to highlight all of that. I have mine set up triple click on a line of text and it'll highlight it all. And I actually pre-imported the blue that is the brand color, so I'm going to choose that out of my swatches. And that is nice and clear and readable. It's significantly smaller than what's on top, so we have a contrast. It creates a hierarchy. That's part of our layout. We want to create a starting point and then a place for our eye to go next. And then we have kind of created this nice vertical line here that kind of draws your eye from the top down to the bottom. So the last few things that we might need to add here are going to be the logo and the URL. And to do that, I would go ahead and you can either, if you are working with vector graphics, you can place those within Photoshop, much as you do in InDesign. Place the linked or place embedded. If you place linked, it'll behave just like it does in InDesign, which means you'll have to save that image with it. For my point, I'm just going to go ahead and do a file open. I'm going to navigate myself to the Campus Votes logo. And I think that probably what is going to work best against that dark background is the reverse out. So I only have a PNG version and not a vector, not an EPS version, but I'm going to go ahead and use that anyway. Open. And here it is over here. And again, we can just click and drag and drop onto our pasteboard or onto our document window. Now that's actually very big. It competes in size, so we're going to have to change the size of that layer. So with that layer selected, I am going to do a transform. That is under the Edit menu, Transform, Scale, or the keyboard shortcut for that is Command T or Control T. And you see I get resizing anchors. This time I have to hold down the Shift key to make sure it constrains proportion. And I am going to, or not, don't hold down the Shift key. I forget that they flip-flop those around. But I'm going to shrink that down and reposition it. And notice that I'm making sure that I am inside my live area guidelines. And once I have that where I want it, I'm going to hit return. So now I have a logo nicely in the bottom. I'll probably finish that by putting the URL for Campus Votes right below it, maybe with a little call to action, visit this website to register today, something to that effect. And then we'd largely have a completed ad. But I did tell you that I was going to show you about making shapes and some things that you could also do in terms of layout that might make easier readability, a more visual interest. Let's say, for example, that our background here was a little bit busier and that this nice strong heading was a little bit hard to read. One thing that you might do is you might consider putting a solid block background behind that and making a subtle transparency just to give some differentiation between the background and the text. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my layers palette. I'm going to manually make a new layer. If you look across the bottom, same place where the trash can is, there is a little plus button, and that is create a new layer. If you click on that, it's going to create a new layer at the top of the stack. So with that new layer created and highlighted, I'm going to go over to my toolbox and I am going to grab that rectangular selection tool. We talked about this earlier. I'm going to bring that rectangular selection tool over and I am going to click and drag a rectangle around where that text is. Now I need to actually fill that with a color. And I am going to do that. You can do that depending on what swatches you have at the bottom of the toolbox. If you just needed, I'm going to go with black and white. If your default colors are not black and white, you can usually just hit the letter D on the keyboard and it will default those back to black and white. You can fill by going up to the Edit menu and choosing fill. And it will ask you whether you want foreground color, and our foreground color right now is black. Our background color is white, or frankly, you can choose black or white straight out of this menu. I'm going to choose white, and I'm going to tell it OK. And I'm going to deselect, which is Command or Control D. So now that obliterates the text underneath it. So what I need to do is I need to move that layer. So I'm going to click and drag and move that layer underneath my text layer, my two text layers actually. So I have to move it several layers down. So it's got to go underneath Register Today and underneath the Physics is Hard, but above the background stuff. Okay, so slight problem here. My white lettering on white background no longer works. So I'm going to have to go in here. It's still there. I'm going to go in there and have to change my color. I'm going to change it to the dark blue this time. Okay. So that now we can read that. It is perhaps a little clunky, but it is readable. One thing that we can do is we can go and select that background rectangle layer in the Layers palette. And we can change, remember we've got blending modes at the top, and we also have opacity. I could change the opacity, I could lower the opacity so we can see a little bit more of that background, but it still gives you a little bit more contrast for your lettering to stand out. And it appears that I missed the punctuation. It also needs to be blue. Okay, so you can make those shapes. You can do circles, you can do squares, you can do all sorts of things. There's actually a shape tool that will let you do custom shapes for turning into outlines and adding fills to. There's all sorts of stuff out there that you can do with Photoshop, and we'll be here all day if I try to show you all of them. But think in terms of when you're making your choices. Think about what's already going on in the layout itself. Do we have circles that we're already working with? Do we have star shapes? In this case, we have both circles and stars. The rectangle picks up the shape of the flag sections on the bottom, so rectangle is not out of the question. There's all sorts of things that you can work to play with to make unity and continuity, and create line. Create visual jumping points, like the red kind of ties into the red on the bottom. So these are all compositional things that you should take into consideration when you're making your choices and positioning your content. For my purpose, I am not liking the white block, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. I am going to go ahead and turn my text back to white where it was originally. And then I would go ahead and save my work. And there is a follow-up video on whether to choose how to save or to export your work into the final product. When you're doing a print ad, you're going to choose save. So theoretically, if you were all done with this and ready to go, you could go up to the File menu, go Save As, and choose the place that you want to save to and the format that you want to save in, whatever was specified in the class documents for upload. It might be JPEG, it might be PNG. Definitely review what's on Canvas for your instructions. Tell it save, and then you're good to go.